Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel, and in this episode, I welcome Darren Brooker. Darren is a longtime creative strategist, most recently with a long stint at Autodesk, working at the intersection of storytelling, design, and technology. He's also a trained architect, a seasoned leader in narrative strategy, and has a background in 3D visual effects and production. His work has earned industry recognition, including BAFTA and Oscar nominations, and he's known for his ability to unify complex ideas into compelling, strategic narratives. In this episode, we explore how storytelling and visual communication, when used together, can transform the way ideas are received and acted upon. We talk about how architectural concepts are often misunderstood, not because they're bad ideas, but because they're not communicated in a way that sticks. Darren explains why the key to influence lies in empathy, emotional engagement, and a deep understanding of how humans process information. Whether it's helping decision makers see the future, winning buy-in for a concept, or navigating the messy early stages of design, he shares lessons drawn from architecture, advertising, companies like Pixar, and more. A key theme from this conversation is how storytelling becomes the most powerful tool we have for making ideas resonate. Whether it's a design proposal, a new process, or a pitch for innovation, we dive into how narrative combined with visual communication is what turns ideas into action inside AEC firms. It's not just about showing the work, it's about making people feel it, understand it, and remember it. As usual, there's an extensive amount of additional information in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. You can find them directly in your podcast app if you're a paid member of Troxel Plus, and if you're a free member, you can find them at the website, which is trxl.co. Lastly, you can really help the podcast by sharing the episodes with your colleagues, and by commenting and sharing my LinkedIn posts. It really boosts the algorithm when you do that. And you can leave a comment over on YouTube and engage with me and the other listeners. So now, without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Darren Brooker. Darren, we met on a rooftop in beautiful downtown San Diego last fall. I actually went away from our conversation like, I have to have that guy on the podcast. So if that really sets the scene here, it's a little bit of putting something out there for the audience to really get into this. But Darren, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you come on the show.
Thank you so much, Evan, for having me. I feel, having listened to quite a few now, I feel like I'm in esteemed company.
Nice.
I like so many of your visitors, or your guests rather. I have architecture lurking deep in my past.
Well, let's talk about that. I would love to hear kind of that origin story. And I mean, this culminates in a brand new thing that you're doing with quite a long stint at Autodesk along the way. But tell us, what is the architecture that's rooted deeply in your past?
Well, the phrase that got bandied about at Autodesk was recovering architect. There was a little club.
Yep.
Of us. There were quite a few of us, but I never was an architect. I was more of a recovering architecture student.
That was enough, was it not?
It was more than enough, honestly.
Right.
Yeah, my adventures in architecture began and ended, in the blink of an eye, in a single degree, where the job board went from completely full at interview stage. By the time I left mid-recession, there were 2 jobs on that job board that 30 of us were fighting over, and I certainly wasn't the best architect, or even probably in the top half of that group, if I'm honest. It's one thing I found out about myself at architecture school. I probably had a lucky escape.
It's kind of painful to figure that out at the end, right? It's like you go through that whole thing, and then like my wife, she has a graduate degree in architecture and has this feeling like she has to use it, even though it's really against the grain of who she is. And I know a lot of people who go through that, and then it's like, well, I paid for this and now I need to use it, and I didn't find something. I can't justify going out and doing something else. Maybe that's less and less of a thing nowadays than it used to be, but I feel like that was it must have been difficult to kind of figure that out and launch into a recession. And then it's like, okay, now what?
I don't know. Well, for one, I was in the UK, so the paid element of the degree wasn't nearly as much as
Mm,
your wife would have paid for sure. I never felt under any pressure to use it. There was no option for that at the time in the
right.
recession. And actually, you know, with hindsight and looking back, I certainly had my crises. But looking back, I feel like it's the unexpected right hand turns in my career that have kind of all added up to something,
Yeah,
and
right.
they just can't be planned for. And I know a lot of people have that kind of experience.
I'm curious because I hear this a lot too, and I feel like this too. It's like I still really valued the education that I got, no matter what I maybe would have ended up doing, even though I did end up practicing architecture. But you hear that a lot as well, right? Recovering architect. Also, I wouldn't trade the educational portion of it for anything else. That was really an incredible experience for a lot of people.
Oh, I totally agree. I wouldn't change what I studied at all. It taught me so much around, you know, systems thinking and human-centered design and you know, being able to stand up in front of a room and take the fiercest critique
Hmm.
ever. I do remember my first ever crit in year one. I stood in front of a fierce Scottish head of year tutor, having presented my project proposal, and he proudly announced to her class, "Darren, symmetry equals the box equals the coffin equals death." And then just stopped speaking. That just left that
Yeah.
dangling, and me stood there. So you know, since that day, I'm uh, I'm able to take any amount of critique and feedback. In fact, I've learned to love it.
Is that also when you learned kind of the power of the pause of dead air at the end of a statement like that?
Abs- oh, absolutely, yes. The power of silence.
Yeah. Yeah,
My
there's
yeah,
so many
no,
people
my
uncomfortable with that, and it's incredible to actually use it to your and just be totally okay with what it's doing psychologically to the others in the room while it's happening.
well, my wife used to be a buyer for a big retail company, and she went on a course in I guess you could call it persuasion. What
Mm.
was it? Negotiation.
Hmm.
Course in negotiation, and she was taught that the key to negotiation is silence, putting other people into that uncomfortable zone.
Yeah. Yeah, and being kind of in communications and storytelling and strategy and media, the things that you specialize in, there I'm sure you run up against people who absolutely can't stand to have that silence and they just have to fill every moment. And I'm just curious what you think about that as far, I didn't expect to maybe go this direction with a conversation, but I think it's such an interesting thing to kind of reflect on right now.
Well, I can reflect and bring us back on track actually, because you know, the people that I work with, uh, especially the ones with an Autodesk, you know, I've written keynotes for every executive position in the entire C-suite, uh, probably like dozens of executives at this time, and there are just like this whole, like you would with any group of a couple of dozen people, right? This whole spectrum of personalities. And, you know, I think what is remarkable for people in such positions of influence and power is that there's a fair skew towards introversion.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily get those people trying to just fill airtime. Um, some you do, absolutely. But a lot of people I deal with are very measured with their contribution.
Yeah, that's interesting. So after you graduated into a recession, where did that lead you?
Well, on a you know a little journey of fun and frivolity for a while after an architecture degree, and then a bit of a you know, first of many crises. And I applied for a whole bunch of design, architecture, technology related jobs before landing one as a journalist alongside a couple of people who you will probably know, Martin Day, and later down the line, Greg Cork.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first job in journalism, and I stayed in journalism for probably 5, 6 years. And the one thing that happened during that 5, 6 years was that technology caught up with my ability and, more importantly, my ambition as a child. I never really wanted to be an architect, actually. I went to my careers advisor at school wanting to be an animator. And, probably the worst careers advice I'd ever got was to go study architecture instead. But my fine art wasn't good enough, and it wasn't good enough. My skill with a pencil wasn't good enough. But it turned out that, one failed degree later and 6 years in technology journalism, and suddenly you didn't need to draw anymore. And you could use a computer. And guess what I fell in love with as a technology journalist? Technology. So suddenly, this right-hand turn I'd taken suddenly added up to something and opened up this whole new path in front of me. So I went and put myself through a master's in visual effects and became a visual effects artist. Turned out I wasn't very good at that either. I won a BAFTA. I was nominated for an Oscar, but all part of a team. And I don't think I was the strongest person on that team either. Again, probably not even the top half of that team, but I got those awards nonetheless, and I'll gladly take them.
Sure.
Because that 5 years was brutal. Visual effects is a really brutal industry of long hours.
I was going to say, it's not unlike architecture. It's totally like a parallel path in that regard.
I'm glad you made that comparison, not me. Having worked with architects recently, building this space that we're in, I don't have any yearning to return to the profession that I left behind. No, nor visual effects.
Yeah, I had a stint in visual effects as well after I had graduated, and I kind of left the firm that I was working for, went off on my own, and I actually have some IMDb credits for like Discovery Channel and History Channel for some specials that were running. And yeah, I used to do a lot of animation work myself, 3D animation.
Oh, we should talk about that. I've got Discovery Channel and History Channel credits as well.
All right, I'll put those links in the show notes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I need to fire up my IMDb profile again. Yeah, but then after animation burned me out and visual effects burned me out, I kind of just looked back and wondered what to do, and noticed that this thread that had run through architecture school, through doing my master's in visual effects, to my career in visual effects, and the one constant through all of that was Autodesk. So
interesting.
That was where I went knocking next.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think as architects, when we think of Autodesk, I don't necessarily think we necessarily think of the other verticals that Autodesk is involved with, and that's just a couple, right? There are quite a few more than that.
Yeah.
But the visual effects industry with Maya, even before Autodesk purchased Maya, right, from, was it Alias? I can't even remember at this point. But
Alias.
That's
yes,
yeah.
Yes.
But there were many other, there was many other software applications that kind of have come and gone in that ecosystem, right? 3D Studio's kind of been there for a very, very long time, and still kind of at the top of the heap, I think. But yeah, it's interesting that was the common thread. Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Softimage.
Softimage is the one that still will annoy visual effects artists of a certain age. Why? And this is a personal opinion, I should stress at this point, why Autodesk ever needed not one, not two, but three applications that did ostensibly the same thing in 3ds Max, Softimage, and Maya.
Yep.
I do not know, but Softimage was a beautiful procedural tool that a lot of people were very sad to see go.
And it has so much more mystique when you read it, you think it's soft image, right? And then somebody says very pretentiously, Softimage. and you're like, oh, okay, it's in another tier than what I was thinking.
Well, a lot of the roots of those visual effects packages, like Maya from Toronto, 3ds Max, the Discrete Logic acquisition, they were a Montreal-based company.
Mm,
So there's a lot of French Canadian influence, so it is important to pronounce it with the accent.
yeah. And there was also like compositing applications, wasn't it combustion back in the day? Or some
Combustion, toxic, and then yeah,
oh my
flame, flint, inferno.
oh, that's
Oh,
right. Yeah, Flint,
I don't know
Flame, and Inferno. Yeah,
how many compositing applications they needed.
yeah, and they all had to do with igniting things on fire in some way or another. Interesting. So, were you writing about these apps when you were working? Were you at AEC Magazine with Martin and Greg, or was it even previous to that?
I was at CAD Desk with Martin, and
Okay.
then AEC with Martin and Greg. Yes, and that's exactly what I was writing about. I was writing about the same things that you talk about here.
Hmm.
Just and it was about that time of the AutoCAD Release 14 debacle. So I remember sitting across from a very intense and busy Martin Day, who was busy on his righteous crusade, a rightful crusade, honestly, trying to light a fire under Autodesk in terms of the performance gap between one version 13 and the next
Hmm.
14, or was it 12 and 13? I can't remember. My memory fades. But yeah, that was my focus as a journalist, and of course, as a journalist, I got access to lots of um, free software, which was kind of like my route into animation was kind of co-funded by the industry. Not that
Yeah.
they knew they were doing it.
It reminds me of the days in architecture school when everybody had tons of software. And this was even before the days when software was literally given away to students, or maybe it kind of coincided with it. But there was a lot of cracked software back in those days that, I mean, every student had Photoshop and Illustrator and Freehand and all of these various Quark Express and PageMaker and all. It's like, how did you get that? Oh, here, let me give you a copy. And I mean, this is how everybody and the software companies didn't really care when it comes to the students, right? Because they also knew that students were getting to use these applications and getting experience with them, and that when they're going to go on and graduate and get a quote unquote real job, I mean, how much more likely were they to actually purchase a license of that software at that point? It was highly likely. But it was interesting just to think about the tools in our toolbox and the thousands and thousands of dollars in tools that we used to basically just trade on thumb drives and zip drives and things like that back in the day.
I think I was a little bit ahead of you. The one thing I do remember in terms of the defining aspect of digital tools in my architecture school was that there was this little kind of CAD studio that I think it took me a few weeks to discover,
Hmm.
honestly, and it felt like this secret little club.
Yeah, very few
None of
students.
the very few students
Hmm.
used it. Very few of the lecturers liked it or respected it.
Hmm.
And I remember doing crazy things to disguise the fact that I was using digital tools, like jamming kind of kitchen roll around a plotter pen so that the pen would wobble in place and give
That's
you these
awesome.
wobbly lines. And the craziest thing was photographing the screen
Uh-huh.
of a PC with a 35 mil film camera
Uh-huh.
and smearing the screen with like a petroleum jelly to try and take away some of the kind of pixelated aspect and getting these kind of more artistic shots of what was, a 3D design sitting there in 3D space displayed
That's
on a monitor.
that's incredible. And I mean, yeah, CRT monitors with curved surfaces. I mean, yeah, we're going
Hmm.
back. We're going back.
Fun times,
All
fun
right.
times.
So where did you go after your journalism stint?
Um, well, after the journalism was the visual effects,
Okay.
and then into Autodesk. And if I kind of fast forward a little, I had a decade in Autodesk within the M&E world, because I came in as a visual effects artist,
Mm.
thinking that everybody in Autodesk would know our tools inside out. Turns
Mm.
out very few do.
Mm.
So I felt like a bit of um, kind of I was a blessed person to have that deep knowledge. So I worked in customer support and customer success, and then in kind of what we call technical sales. So the person who goes out with the salespeople to the customers and can kind of translate between the talk of a salesperson, the need of a customer, and sit in the middle with the laptop open, trying to find the middle ground and some reality. I did that for the best part of a decade, and then I applied for a job, and this was a total reach. I applied for a job as our CEO's speechwriter. That was how it was advertised, and not thinking that I would get it, being based in the UK, working in a M&E technical sales team. It took it took someone, the hiring manager, his name was John Pittman, to see that all those little pieces, the architecture degree,
Mm-hmm.
the technology journalism, the visual effects, that customer experience that I had, like all of that could add up to something that was what a CEO needed in
That's
his
interesting.
speeches.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be like life-changing. Honestly, John changed my life. I think looking back on it now, I kind of, I recontextualize it that the one constant in my life has not been Autodesk. Actually, it's been story, from the films that I made, to the books that I've written, to the speeches and the speculative fiction that I write today. Just story through different forms.
Mm-hmm.
Some digital, some very analog.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break from the conversation to tell you about AVAIL. Is your team struggling to find the BIM assets they need? AVAIL's content management system simplifies access to all of your firm's content in one easy-to-use platform. No matter where your files live or what type of files they are, you can easily search and access them from AVAIL. Now, designers can consistently find and reuse all types of content. So what does that mean? Well, standards compliant models and drawings are easier to create. The documentation process is less chaotic. New hires are easier to onboard. Projects are delivered faster with fewer errors. You get the idea. Visit getavail.com to try AVAIL for free and request a free demo. That's getavail.com, GETAVAIL.com. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now let's get back to the conversation. This is why I remember going away from our happy hour on the rooftop thinking, like, I've got to talk more with Darren, because like there's so many parallels here in my experience in and around the industry, our education, kind of this tech thread that weaves through all of this. But something that really became apparent to me in a role that I had, and I still have, is communication. Like it's so important. I actually felt like, okay, yes, I'm an architect. Yes, I'm a technologist. Yes, I'm a father. Yes, I am outdoors enthusiast. But through all of these things, being able to communicate, and like you said, you would go out on the technical sales and you would basically translate between these two very different vocabularies of software sales and users. And I've found myself in that position so many times where maybe it's between the users of the practice of architecture, like the software technology and the practice of architecture, and the C-suite. Again, there's like a big disconnect there. And then throw IT into that too, right? It's like and I basically earned my stripes by working with clients doing design work. And so going through architecture school, then becoming an architect, working with lots and lots and lots of giant clients who you've got 30 people in a room and you've got to distill everything down that they talk about into a building at some point. And so it's like this idea of synthesis, but also getting everybody on the same page and getting consensus and moving forward and getting decisions documented so that we could move forward. And that is very much a communications thing. And so I'm just curious from your point of view, like I was using the word communications,
Yeah.
and then you're using the word storytelling. And I'm curious if you really do you see a difference between those? I mean, I could imagine like the approach might be different and there might be a better way for me to talk about the kinds of things that I'm doing, but I think a lot of it is rooted in story rather than just communication sounds a little more generic.
Well, isn't everything we tell ourselves a story? That's one answer to that question. But I think, yeah, there's massive parallels, honestly. I think, what do I think? No, I think the hiring manager, John, always talks about tool sets, skill sets, and mindsets, this kind of head, heart, hands thing. And I feel like I shifted from tool sets, and the really successful phase of my career has been around skill sets and mindsets. And that mindset part is exactly what you talk about, whether it's storytelling or communication. And I think here's where there are the parallels between storytelling and your world of digital practices, that they're both kind of these core practices that overlap so much of a company. They're both really central, and really some of the key skills are exactly what you outlined, the kind of the advocating for change and the building understanding. And it's all about people, and that situation that you described of taking 30 people's input and distilling it down to a building. Yeah, I would often have 30 people's input to distill down into a messaging document, a draft script, a storyboard, and yeah, bringing people along, not just
Mm-hmm.
kind of starting at the end,
Yeah.
bringing people along, because that's key element of persuasion, I think.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the idea of story and kind of weaving a story arc. So I've been a big student of like Apple's keynotes over the years. Back when Steve Jobs used to
Yes.
deliver them on stage, and
Yeah.
you would turn on the Steve Jobs, kind of reality distortion field they used to call it, right? And where the audience would basically suspend belief and trust, and because the story was usually so compelling and simple, that was a key element. But it took
Yeah.
so I became acutely aware of how difficult it was, like in architectural design, to distill something down to its essence and really communicate that essence to people. And I guess those were kind of the original training grounds for this was presenting your project in a crit, right, at
Yeah.
in school. But over the years, really becoming a student of how to tell the story of what you want to say and get everybody going, nodding their heads and engaging with it and going along with it, to me it is an art and it is a skill that you can develop. And I wanted to have you on the show because I feel like, a lot of, you mentioned it a minute ago, like a lot of people in these industries are introverted by nature. And it's not like they just want to talk all the time. They don't want to, they actually don't want to talk all the time. It's completely draining. But when they do, the words really need to matter. And if it isn't a skill you're actively developing, then you actually aren't going to make the impact or land the thing that you're trying to land. And so this is something that I really want to help people out with because it is so critical to be able to do that. And I'm just curious, like I just threw a bunch of stuff out there, but I'm curious what this is kind of stirring up in you.
Well, you gave me a few things there. You gave me, we're onto the tool set, skill set, mindset thing. There's the skill set piece and learning, and those, those skills of story and how other people might learn them. I think
Mm,
there's the keynote piece and Apple starting this thing all that time ago that is now so big.
right.
The power of keynotes these days. You look across the technology spectrum from your Apple to Microsoft, Nvidia, Meta, whoever. Like the power of product launch now has become such a big thing that like Taco Bell are launching products with keynotes, or at least they did last year, it's got to a point where I think, what do I think? I think making keynotes has become like making movies in that, expectations are sky high, and the experience is really changing. Budgets are still completely flat, exactly like Hollywood. But I think going back to the learning piece, there's a lot to be learned from keynotes. And actually, I learned something from Apple this year, or late last year rather. And there was a keynote where they were talking about Apple Intelligence, and we were wrestling with AI at Autodesk. I was wrestling with AI and how we talked about it. And suddenly there was this AI arms race, and all any technology company wanted to talk about was AI. And we were, in my strategy role, I was talking to all of these different groups, and we kind of assembled this big document of where AI was prevalent in or present even across our big portfolio. And what we found that it was all these kind of small use cases. And I think that's still very true of a lot of the AI landscape. It's kind of quite siloed or niche little use cases. And rather than try and talk about AI in this kind of big visionary way, which is, generally what you do when you try and craft a story, you generally try and make somebody's idea as big as possible. Actually watching Apple Intelligence being launched and the way that they were talking about Apple Intelligence being these simple, small, practical, delightful things that just help people do what they want to do. And it was a real aha moment, actually. And we kind of, we took a bit of a pivot from trying to find this kind of big overarching way to talk about AI at Autodesk to talking just in very practical terms about, drawing automation in Fusion or sketch constraints, where we were talking about these kind of small, fairly niche applications, but in ways that were just, very true to what users would want, just saving them time, reducing guesswork, grunt work, but making a story kind of small rather than big. And it really resonated. So there's a ton of different ways to tell stories, and keynotes can teach us a lot about them, particularly I think in the technology landscape. But if I can plug my new venture very briefly, on the learning front, actually today I launched a workshop. My new venture is called Great Big Stories, and I launched a storytelling workshop called Storytelling Sprint, which is this kind of cyclical, agile, 4-stage workshop that goes through these 4 phases and is designed to be repeated and designed to be repeatable, actually. So the aim of it is to help people make these small ideas into big stories, and to make the entire process repeatable so that they can put story to work when they've left the workshop.
So you are teaching people how to basically come up with use this framework to get their ideas out there. And so in that regard, it's repeatable because it doesn't apply to any one specific outcome or use case, I should say. The outcome is similar maybe across these, but the use case isn't specific.
Yeah, it's a very kind of generalized approach and draws on, a lot of kind of human-centered design techniques. A lot of these things, a lot of stickies. I love them, but
I can't tell. Dan.
Yeah, it just
there are how many of these are on your desk? How many sticky notes?
I'm running out. I think these are all still property of Autodesk. Technically, I'm gonna have to start buying my own soon. Yeah, but if we go back to that tool sets, mindset, skill sets, right? So the tool sets was kind of phase 1 of my career. Mindsets has been really big, but something I worked really hard when I was in that storytelling role was to teach people the art of storytelling and the methods of storytelling. And I ran a workshop within Autodesk that hit between 500 and 600 different people within the company, and people loved it. It set Autodesk alight for a little while, and then COVID hit, and it didn't all of a sudden. But yeah, I loved delivering those workshops and really kind of sharing some of my secret sauce. And I think really it was the methods that I use that I enjoyed sharing the most, because I think that's what came from things like architecture school.
Hmm. Are you willing to share a little hint of those kinds of methods? Because I think to me, what's interesting about this is, yeah, I'll take a workshop if it's included at my company for free. And I think a lot of firms are investing in their staff, but there's also people out there who aren't getting that investment, and they might have to find it on their own, especially if they want to develop skills and take these kinds of things to the next level. So are you willing to share a couple hints about the kinds of methods that you're talking about?
Yeah, of course, of course. So the workshop goes through 4 phases, and I'm probably going to get this wrong now. It's discover, define, design, refine. Right. So discovery is all about asking yourself questions about who your audience are, what they care about, and what you want them to leave with. So it's all about looking at your audience. And then the second part, define, is okay, so now you know what your audience care about. What do you care about? What's your idea? What do you want to communicate? And really just kind of breaking that idea apart into its component parts and looking at all the different pieces and how they could potentially fit together in support of, what you want your audience to hear. And then the second half of the workshop goes into design, which is really moves into kind of how you express that idea. You've broken it into pieces, how you kind of put it back together again. At this point, you really are juggling lots of post-its around. And then refine is the final section where you put it into your tone, your voice, your style, so you're comfortable with it. And then you go back and you look at the audience part again and your idea again, and just, progressively refine this thing. But some of the methods within, some of them are really simple, from, like a 6x2 with, where do you want to move your audience from, to things like think, feel, do, right? Like, what would you want them to think, feel, do? But we use things like abstraction ladders, where, you take your idea and you put it on a sticky and you ask yourself why, and you go up the ladder and you write, why is story important? Why? And you go up the ladder because that has an emotional pull, because it drives human connection. And then to go down the ladder, you ask yourself, how? So how do we tell story? And that's where you get into the kind of the mechanics and the methods. So, in my jobs in strategy, I've worked in technology strategy, brand strategy, and corporate strategy. Like we would use a lot of these kind of methods within workshops that I would design and facilitate. And I think a lot of people think that the stories just get written. Yeah. There's just, just like architecture, right? You don't just go and design one building. There's a whole bunch of work and discovery beforehand, and there is so much discovery behind a lot of the stories that end up getting told. We're Autodesk are a big, complex company, just as fragmented as the construction industry, for example. And there's a lot of groups who have their own ways of talking about things and their own strategies and their own ideas, and you need to kind of bring all that together. So there's a lot of these techniques in the strategy work I do, and I brought a lot of that to the storytelling workshops.
And applying this to, the listener who's listening to this, I think it applies at a personal level and many levels beyond that, right? The reason I bring that up is because I think a lot of times when it's like, well, where's my next step in my career? Where's the next step for my team, those underneath me. Like there's so many different ways to consider this and how you can implement it to move things along, right? It's not just at a large, keynote by the CEO of Autodesk level that you're talking to here. This really applies down all the way to the individual level.
Yeah, and when I ran the workshops within Autodesk, we didn't ask them necessarily to bring like a business story they wanted to tell. 90% of people would, but then the 1 in 10 would bring something about some docent work they were doing, some volunteer work they were doing, like anything, like a passion project. And we heard so often at the end of the session that not only did it help them bring that story to life, it just helped them in their personal lives understand how to, back to your point, to communicate more I was going to say persuasively, that's what some people said, but more impactfully is a kind of word.
Let's take a short break from the conversation to invite you to join the most influential technology leaders in the AEC industry at Confluence. Composed of in-person events and a podcast co-hosted by yours truly, Confluence is designed to foster conversations between AEC firms and technology companies so they can learn, share, and engage with each other to support industry innovation. Software company AVAIL, which creates content management solutions for the AEC industry, started hosting Confluence events in 2019 to understand what firms are needing, wanting, and thinking around technology. To learn more about Confluence, explore upcoming events, and listen to podcast episodes, go to confluence.getavail.com. My thanks to Confluence for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation. So if we turn the magnifying glass back onto you now, you're launching this new venture, Great Big Stories, and I assume that you applied kind of this framework to, maybe it's just ingrained in you at this point, but you have to launch this. You have to put the message out, and you have to talk about it, and the way that you talk about it matters, and the words that you use, and the language. And I'm curious from your perspective, like now applying it to yourself, what that was like, and what you've been through the last couple months.
That is a very good question, and one I have not really considered actually, or spent time reflecting on. What is it like working for myself as a client? It was delightful is my first answer.
I'm my best
because
client.
because all my ideas were good, right? They all met with client's approval,
right?
And as a result, it all came together very quickly. I mean, it kind of needed to come together very quickly. So we hit the brief, me, myself, and I, and I really like moving quickly. I just prototyping things and getting them, not aiming for perfection, just getting 80% of the way. And that's something I'm really drawn to with AI as a bit of a side note, and how quickly AI can get you 3/4 of the way somewhere.
Yeah.
But I really like this idea of being able to iterate quickly. That's kind of what the workshop really talks about. But I have such a just a brain that's wired for this kind of work these days, having done particularly the time leading brand strategy. You could give me an idea, and I could give you a brand pretty quickly. I can't guarantee it would be good, but I'm not sure on the ideation front. And in fact, that's kind of I guess that's where I really like working, is the upfront work. I guess my old boss would have said I'm a starter, not a finisher. Give me the interesting ideation work, not the the tidy up and the project reports and and the archival. That's probably best left for somebody else. But yeah, this was a very quick prototype, and just got refined very quickly, and I'm really happy with it. The acid test is whether the clients come my way.
Right, right. Well, my process, I feel like I operate a little differently. I like to go quickly too, but then I like to just let it simmer for quite a long time and let my subconscious work on it because I
Yes.
find that I find inspiration all over the place. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting how it's like, oh, that right there was meant for this project. And I'm so glad that that project has just kind of been simmering because this makes that project so much better. And kind of a really diverse, podcasts and YouTube videos and internet and just getting out into nature and talking with people. And it's interesting how you can find little pieces all over the place that apply back to something that was completely disconnected from that. And by just allowing that simmering to happen and that subconscious work of, I really truly trust my subconscious to be working on things when I'm not actively thinking about them. And then it's like, oh, okay, all of a sudden, it's like this is design. This is how design has always worked for me. And I think creativity kind of works like innovation, another word that comes to mind, right? Where it doesn't
Mhm.
happen upon command. It doesn't happen right when you want it. It does for some people, I think, who are well versed in years and years and years of doing creative work because they've always shown up and really built those muscles to do it.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about though how what seems like a completely disconnected set of categories and boxes can actually really weave together in really interesting spontaneous moments because you're just paying attention and you kind of have to have Rick Rubin talks about it like this, right? He talks about having you're tuned in. You have to have your antennas out and accepting to tune things in like that, but when they're there, it's you really have to notice.
Yeah, you're totally right. I always loved my commute when I was working in London or the Bay Area. In London, I would run home and I'd run 8 miles to work and 8 miles home from work.
Literally
And
run home. You would not a
I,
figure of
I
speech.
no, 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 not a figure of speech at all. I'd leave my stuff at work. I'd put my running stuff on, put my headphones on because they weren't called AirPods back then, but I'd put them on and I'd run, and all of that noise in my head and all of these different
Mm-hmm.
things,
Mm-hmm.
these different aspects, and all of this input that I'd received from all these people. Yeah, all it needed was just to stare out at a skyline and to just let my mind kind of just count, right? Counting steps, counting breaths, and things would just start to emerge. And the same in San Francisco, catching the Bay Ferry across to Oakland, where I lived. I'd just kind of sit and stare, and sometimes I'd listen to recordings of myself reading through keynotes in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And just that act of kind of separating yourself from the keyboard and the writing and the people and there's a book actually that you would probably love called can't remember the author, Japanese author, but the book is called Things I Think About When I Think About Running. And it's
Mm.
all about the creative process and that aspect of separation in his case and my case through running.
Yeah. How important, or well, I guess another way to say it, that now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, is like, is that what your practice is? Is it still to go running, or do you is it found in other ways? Because like for me, it's like, and I think again this goes back to Steve Jobs and like how important just going on a walk was for him to actually
Yeah.
work out ideas and disconnect from the monitor, the screen, the people, whatever it was, and just get out and just that pacing really starts to stir up kind of that introspection, that reflectivity that you need inside to kind of work things out.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be running. And you know what? I haven't had a commute since COVID, so there hasn't been a lot of
Mm.
running to and from work.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just getting out and walking, and Autodesk's HQ at One Market in San Francisco is a big building. You could do laps of the floors, and often like you do a lap of the floor, and you'd end up having a spontaneous conversation with
Mm-hmm.
somebody who
Mm-hmm.
It could come from any part of the business, but because of all those storytelling workshops that I led, because of the work I did, there was no shortage of conversations to be had. And often that's what I miss about physical work, are those kind of those chance encounters and
Hmm.
those little things that spark something else.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can be walking, it can be these little kind of adjacent conversations. It can definitely be running, but I think for me at least, and it sounds a bit like for you, like nothing beats fresh air on the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you could be outside, I could be on a bike ride, and it's really important to not have my headphones in and to not be listening to something, because then I just completely tune out. Like I can't think about the things that I'm talking about with you right now when there's something else going into my ears. And what's funny is because when I'm working, it's the opposite. Like I can't be listening to anything else because it will completely distract me from the work that I'm doing. It will also distract me when I'm outside from doing the thinking that we're talking about doing right now.
Yeah, it's like trying to read and listen at the same time. I guess you just can't do
Totally. Uh,
you can't do both.
yeah.
But no, I mean, like sometimes I need the noise and the distraction, and sometimes I
Yes.
find I can't listen to things like audiobooks and podcasts because my mind is
Yep.
so active, and I just come back to the podcast. A minute has gone,
Yep.
and all I've been thinking about is something from my
Yeah.
professional life, personal
You
life,
didn't hear a bit of it.
whatever.
Right.
Yeah, a certain age when you have building projects going on and kids who need running around everywhere on a job, like, your thoughts are pulled in 100 different directions. Um, but sometimes, yeah, I need something that has like some rhythm to it. I think the counting, be it like swimming, cycling, running, I think something that just kind of takes me out of myself. I guess you enter that kind of flow state, right? Where um, you're in the zone of doing something, but it's not a doing something that requires a huge amount of mental focus,
Yeah. Right.
but it require
Autopilot.
it
Right.
requires a different kind of focus. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's when things for me can just kind of start to bubble up quite naturally. And that's what
Yeah.
that book was about, the things I think about when I think about running, or at least one of the chapters was.
Yeah. Let's just focus in on the word story. And I mean, you chose your website as Great Big Stories and what you're pursuing here. I mean, we talked about kind of the importance of telling good stories, but maybe you can give us kind of more a deeper thesis on the idea of why stories matter more than just getting your points out.
Big old question, Evan.
Yeah.
I mean,
Is
we're
it
wired
because
for
it's
story.
wired into our DNA, like at a
I was just about to say
campfire level?
I was about to say exactly the same thing. Like we are wired for story, right? And
Mm,
I think that it's such a human thing that we just crave it. I think it's I had a boss that used to say that story is like fire. And when he first said it, he said it out of context, and I went and I thought about it, and I was just thinking that it was something so elemental, like the campfire thing, right?
mm,
And what he actually meant is that stories like fire, in terms of the heat and light that it can generate, that it can cause, the heat lighting a fire under under somebody's
yeah.
seat can cause them to move, to act, and the light is just, it can cause people to see and really shine a light on something and open people's mind. I think storytelling is such an incredible mechanism to get ideas across. We could all just present a very compelling PowerPoint deck of slides and data, and some people are really, really wired for that. Um, but it turns out, I think, if you weave a story around that data, it becomes so much more compelling.
Hmm. And memorable, right? Like to me, if I'm going to listen to somebody basically read their PowerPoint deck and the bullet points and the charts and the data that's presented in that, It's like, well, I could just
Yep.
refer back to the deck, right? I don't need, it speaks for itself. I didn't need somebody necessarily to narrate it. But story is one of those things where it's like, oh, you kind of had to be there, right? To hear the delivery when it's done well, like you had to be there, you had to hear it in person, because there's so many more dimensions to storytelling than just the audible, just the words that are coming across and going into your ears, right? It's body language, it's emphasis, it's pacing, it's all of these things. And so, I mean, now kind of like taking this even into the performance of the storytelling, especially in a keynote, right? And really landing that story authentically. What's that been like to work with for you? Because I'm sure there's people who are good examples and there are people who are bad examples, but maybe you could just kind of point to the what makes a good example versus a bad example. Like what's really happening there from your perspective?
Well, I think, I've worked with such a spectrum of different presenters, people who are incredibly apprehensive, and their mechanism is to just prepare really well
Mm-hmm.
and learn the thing inside out, and people who can leave their prep till the last minute because they're such natural. They have such natural presence, and they kind of know what they want to say. They know the material inside out. They're quite frustrating to write for, that group. Like, just tell me so we can both do our jobs rather than just
Yeah.
you. But I think some people, and some people can get on stage and tell a joke, and some people just really shouldn't, or, just can't. And I think finding your style, your authentic tone, your voice, your style, is really important. We employ kind of performance coaches at things like Autodesk University, who will teach people, how to physically connect with the audience, how to use their body language, how to use the stage. And you see some people just do it really naturally. Some people, even with the coaching, it just feels like you're, fighting against the grain. But it comes with practice, and it comes with feedback, and it comes, like a lot
Yeah.
of things,
Yeah.
just with the building that muscle memory. But I think it all comes down to authenticity. And do you need your chief technology officer to be, there's an aspect that you want that persona to be a little bit geeky, right? And if that person is a little bit kind of engineering minded and a bit geeky and maybe a little wooden, like, I don't necessarily see that as a
Yeah.
bad thing. You
Right.
don't want that in everybody. But I think the one thing that's changed about keynotes through the years, I went to Google I/O just before COVID hit. I think it was probably 2018. And what I saw there was like them using this tremendous cast of characters. If they were talking about, their automotive stuff, they would bring out the leader of that business group. If they were talking about, um, search, email, whatever, they would bring out the best person,
Mm-hmm.
to the person with the knowledge. What it did was give this tremendous diversity to the speaking lineup. Made the whole thing tremendously complex because you had like a dozen plus presenters. But at the time, lots of companies, Autodesk included, were kind of doing this one or two person show. Like, for years, we just had
Right.
CEO, CTO at Autodesk University, and that was something that like Carl Bass and Jeff Kowalski. You can draw a line right back to that. But I really like the idea of using a bigger cast of characters. I think it gives more perspectives. It gives more like differing levels of energy, and I don't think many people have got the attention anymore for an hour or even a 75-minute keynote. If it's like that
Yeah.
one talking head, if it's like a stand and deliver thing, which is
Right.
why what I said before, that keynotes are becoming more like films, is that they are becoming these like very like multi-act
Yeah.
productions where you have lots of people, short videos, broken up by like, I hate the word fireside chats, but all of those kind of aspects. And I think, I think as an audience member, unless you have somebody who's an incredible communicator, like a Steve Jobs, like you wouldn't want to be listening to them for an hour.
Right. Hey everyone, let's take a quick break from the conversation to pay some bills around here. This episode of Troxel is brought to you by Troxel Plus members. That's right, my incredible paid supporter members are making this episode possible. Their direct support ensures that I can continue exploring the intersection of architecture, technology, and the future of design with the leading voices in our industry directly to you. So let's talk about why you might consider financially supporting the podcast too. By becoming a Troxel Plus supporter, you're not just helping sustain these conversations, you're also gaining exclusive benefits like ad-free episodes of the show and my Leadership Edge email newsletter, where I analyze episodes and deliver the insights and key takeaways right into your inbox. Your small contribution makes a huge impact. And if you've been enjoying Troxel and want to be part of the community that keeps it thriving, please consider joining today. Head on over to trxl.co and click the subscribe button either in the upper right-hand corner or at the bottom of the page, or you can visit the link that I've put into the show notes. Once again, my sincerest thanks to the Troxel Plus members who have made this episode of the podcast possible, even though they aren't even hearing this ad because theirs are ad-free. Now, let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, there's a lot going on modern keynotes, and to just kind of talk about that complexity of a multicast lineup, like the handoffs alone, right, and the timing, and not to mention all the technology behind it with wireless mics and teleprompters, and I mean, there's just so many things. Speaking of teleprompters, I'm curious, like your point of view on. I mean, you talked a little bit about rehearsing and kind of knowing the stuff inside and out, and some people really dedicate themselves to that and so that it comes off authentically and naturally. And then there's others who just go up and literally read the teleprompter. I was at a very large keynote and it was like there was a standing applause and it was like, I need everyone to, the person on stage literally said, I need everyone to sit down so I can read the teleprompter because they didn't have very many things to say. It was like just the next thing that we were going to be doing as a group, and it was like I need everyone to sit down so that I know what to say, so that I say it. But like the level of dependence on that is, I think, on maybe it was practice, maybe it was nerves, or lack of practice, and maybe it was nerves, or maybe it was a combination of a bunch of things. But at the same time, it's like there is like kind of this layer of extra that a lot of people are worried about, but also depend on. And I'm curious from your point of view when you're coaching people and you're working through these workshops. I mean, coming up with a story, I'm sure really helps people kind of anchor back into telling a story and not reading features and benefits and bullet points and things like that.
Well, some companies, believe it or not, don't even script. Like Salesforce, Mark Benioff does not read a script. He has a bunch of bullets. He expresses them in the way he wants to express them. Nobody argues with him, but that's part of their company culture. So that's their norm, and it works for Salesforce. At Autodesk, the norm was teleprompters, but the norm was not to use them as a crutch and not to depend on them. The norm was to finish your script 2 weeks out, to learn it inside out. And then the teleprompter is there for you to free you, right? If you don't have to look at it, great. But it's there and it's tracking you. And if you lose your train of thought or you want to put in some side anecdote that you've just been thinking about the day before on your run that introduced all these new layers, you know, you can come back to what was there. So we kind of use it. Yeah, I was just going to use the phrase safety net. We kind of use it as a safety net. And honestly, somebody saying, sit down, I need to read the teleprompter. Why didn't they have one at the bottom of the stage? That's
yes. All right. Fail.
That's a production. That's a production company not doing their job. Yeah.
Perhaps. Yeah, I mean it is interesting. I'm curious from like where you sit when it comes to telling stories in front of an audience. I mean, do you have any kind of immediate or rules of thumb like when it comes to actually engaging with people? I mean, there's the standard tropes of like don't read the slides and don't put a certain font on the slides less than a certain size. But I'm actually curious more from like an attention point of view, to keep people's attention. I think there's a lot of times when people are selling, and you can use storytelling, you could call it story selling. I've heard that word recently. This
Yeah.
idea of using these techniques, but then it doesn't matter if you can't engage an audience. And this applies to webinars, it applies to blog posts, it applies to podcasts, it applies to town hall meetings and keynotes, all of these things. And so from your point of view, like how much time do you actually have to make an impact on somebody so that they're giving you their most precious resource, which is their attention?
Used to be 12 seconds. I'm not quite sure it is 12 seconds
Wow.
anymore. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things I can say there, right? Like people shouldn't be reading slides. Nobody should be reading slides.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just it's an attention killer. But I think that the first words and your presence on a stage are hugely important. And I think there has to be some provocative idea that is within the first couple of sentences of anybody's arrival on stage, which is kind of why I hate I'm really excited to be here. It's like, well, show, don't tell, just be excited and tell us what you're here
Darren,
to talk about.
You just described like my opening line for every podcast. So excited to have this conversation. All right, point taken.
But you can't show quite as readily, right? At least not the way I consume your podcast. But I think being more serious, one component part of my workshop is really about leaving gaps, and that's what I talked about when I said when we get to the second phase of the workshop, the define phase, and looking at a big idea and breaking it into its component parts. And you break it into its component parts so you can kind of leave these like information gaps. You break it into parts for two reasons, really. You break it into parts to build contrast, so you can take kind of like the status quo, something is bad, these tools don't work, and then you can have the blissful ideal of, but with this this new tool, everything will be more connected. And if you go from those kind of those peaks to those troughs, rather than just doing like all peak and then trough, or all trough and then peak, like that, one's a sales pitch for one.
Mm-hmm.
If you just go, these are all the ways that our software is amazing, will you buy it? That's like, it's not the most compelling story you could tell. But I think these information gaps serve another purpose, right? And Malcolm Gladwell is a master of doing this. He leaves these little gaps in the story, and it's it's frustrating as a reader in the most amazing way. Like, you want to read on because your curiosity is just like craving for these little pieces. It's kind of like watching a murder mystery sometimes, but like leaving these little gaps where people's curiosity can take root. And I think if you do that and you don't feed the whole thing to somebody really easily, and you actually feed it to them in little pieces and leave gaps between them, actually I think they take more ownership of that story because they've had to work to kind of be part of your story. And I'm not suggesting that you make things difficult to understand, but I think it's just about these little gaps and revealing information quite intentionally in different ways. And that's a big thing, I think, that makes for compelling stories.
Yeah, so it brings up a few thoughts for me, and I think it kind of goes back to this idea of some individuals who feel like they have to fill every silence with words and talking, right? Like not being
Yep.
comfortable with silence. which is another form of a gap, right? But this idea that all of the information has to be presented for someone to make a decision or to move forward, and I don't. That's not the case, right? It's like there's so many times where you would be better served with a meaningful follow up because somebody is so interested they just can't wait to hear what happens next, right? We've all seen the clickbait headlines too, right? You won't believe what happens next. And then it's like, okay, well, I guess I'll click on the article to find out what happens next. But it's because it's a very human thing to want to know where this is going. And if you tell it all up front, then there's
Yep.
no mystery. There's nothing for me to dig into, nothing for me to want to follow up with. And I see this with architects and technologists all the time. It's like lists and lists and lists of things and the reason why and the other perspective. And here's all of the versions of it. And it's like, okay, well, I guess that's all of it. I don't need to know anymore. It was actually too much. And therefore now I'm overwhelmed with information and I can't make a decision at all. I can't decide that I want to follow up on that.
Yeah, yeah, I guess, I described the presentation before that's just like, if you think of the positive up here and the negative down here, and you kind of plot this graph over time, the sales pitch is like, it's all at the top, right? It's just a flat line that runs positive, positive, positive. But then I guess if you think about like, I spent a lot of time when I was in corporate strategy, we were nestled within the research team under the CTO, bizarrely. Not often you'd find corporate strategy in under a CTO, but that's where it was under Jeff Kowalski. And I spent a lot of time, we were a very kind of research-driven company. Research really drove our agenda back then, and the stories that we told, particularly we tell, stories about what we were doing in our robotics lab when, there was no commercialization of that technology at that point. And spent a lot of time reading that team's research reports, and they all had the same kind of template, right? It's like, here's my research, here's all my findings, and here's my conclusion. So it was exactly as you described, right? I'm going to tell you all the factors that leads me to this conclusion. And I guess, the only time where you do tell everything up front, where there's really a legitimate case for that, is like an executive summary where you have these really time-starved people who are just like, right, just tell me. But again, you don't tell them everything, right? You distill the most salient pieces. But it's funny with that kind of pitch-based story and that like R&D type story, like one all along the top, one all along the bottom. Like there just isn't any room there's no dramatic structure to either of those methods. And I think that's the key to storytelling and these gaps that I talk about is dramatic structure.
And that is really something that humans are wired for, right? Like you're actually going against the grain when you're just dumping it all out there and just leaving it to the audience to sift through or to not have anything to follow up with.
Yeah, and we also, we love stories about people. I think when I started the role at Autodesk with Carl Bass, when was that, 2015? We were telling these very technology-led stories, and there were very few people in the stories. They were all stories about products or research. And even when we like looked out in the world, I remember Carl telling the story to his visit of the new Apple HQ, the big cylindrical building, and he was struck by the concrete down in the parking garage having like little RFID tags on each of the concrete panels. And I had to put his visuals together. So I had, as a visual effects artist, to come up with a slide because he couldn't take a photograph of like, we had this big discussion about if Apple made concrete, what would it look like? And I found a photo of a car in a garage, and I spent a long time just rendering like a different wall treatment and compositing it in. And like, we got to this beautiful kind of polished, smooth concrete and we rejected the Microsoft version of that. And sorry, I digress here, Evan. What was the point I was trying to make with this digression?
You lost me, Darren. I'm sorry. I don't know.
I think I was talking about the move to people, right? That's
You
where
were.
I was. Sorry, I didn't need to speak that thought out loud, but I did. I could have just thought harder. No, so we were telling these stories like literally about concrete in a garage, and there were no people in this story apart from Carl, and it was
Right.
kind of what Carl had seen in the world, and it really took me quite a long time to move Autodesk from this very product-centric view of what they wanted to tell the world to putting people at the center of these stories. And Autodesk customers, man, they do the most interesting things. They're what keep so many people at that company for so long, and what the customers do with that story, with that technology. You work for Facebook. Imagine what the diversity of their customer output is.
Sure.
But you work at Autodesk, you got people making airplanes, cars, buildings, bridges, blockbuster movies. There's this like endless supply of these incredible stories. And when I started in that role, the way we would tell a story, we would just kind of tell the story of the customer, and we kind of stand behind them and just, hope that we got some positive associations by what they were doing. And it took me quite a long time for us to kind of step out in our stories and step side by side with the customers. But I shifted us from this very research and product and brought people and customers and took us to a place where we were like really, really comfortable telling stories that had purpose at their heart and people at their heart. And I think that was kind of the key era of storytelling before we got into, we then went back again to technology with platform and AI. But like at that point, which was probably like 2018, I think the story Autodesk was telling was the most poetic expression of that company I've seen.
So if we use your abstraction ladder, I mean, talk about the why there because of that connection. I mean, there's a few reasons that I can think of. I'd love to hear from your point of view, right? Of like, why does that make such a difference? And why was that so important to you?
Why did it make such a difference? I love that you're using my abstraction ladder back on me. You're a ninja. I think like we had this overarching framework of more, less, better, and I'm not going to be able to remember it now, but it was the inevitability of more, the reality of less, and the opportunity of better, which is a grammatical error. It should be the opportunity for better, but we stuck with all the ofs, and the more was about inevitable demographic shifts and more people, more demand. And then the reality of less was about consumption and our, need to be more aware of our footprint and our consumption. And then this opportunity of better was kind of what you could fit. It was this big umbrella that you kind of fit anything under that addressed those issues, right? So, and we kind of put ourselves and our products and our customers underneath that. And there was the keynote in either 2018 or 2019, where we were just at the peak of our powers. We've been telling that story for 3 years. I got Autodesk to try and thinking trilogies so that we weren't changing our story every year, and we were kind of evolving the story for 3 years, and we start to think of kind of like the first, second, and third film in the trilogy. And 2018 or 2019, let's get it right, in the program notes, was the final one of the trilogy. So we knew the story really well. We knew how to best to bring it to life, and we had such incredible guests that year. We had Asa Kalama from Walt Disney Imagineering. We featured a story with Airbus, with Volkswagen, and that was in the middle of their kind of emissions scandal. Who else did we have? that year. Um, yeah, Elizabeth Houslip and Bill Change was incredible. It was us at the peak of our storytelling powers. And I think it was like all the component parts were working, and we kind of, we hit within that kind of inevitability of more, reality of less. There's natural contrast, right? Particularly with the reality of less, of the promise of a better world and a better planet. And, the flip side of the coin there is, the cost of current practices and the impact on the planet. And I think something I tell people in storytelling workshops all the time is to look at both sides of an idea, right? Like if you are going in pitching something because it adds a benefit, like what's the pain point? What's the flip side of that idea? And then going back to the kind of the format of the workshop and that first phase of being discover in your audience, like which side of an idea will appeal to an audience more? Is it the positive aspect? Is it the negative aspect? Because sometimes I think we have a tendency to lead with the positive when actually it's the negative that hits home.
It's going to elicit a stronger emotion potentially, right? And then it kind of gets back into that idea of like what my attention and engagement then could actually happen at a deeper level, because you're striking in my values at this point, right? And that alignment, hopefully, I think is going to be something that could be really powerfully strong. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So an interesting perspective that I think I brought to that I was thinking of when you were talking about this is this idea that by bringing in these stories from real people and real companies that aren't you, I mean, it's serving kind of two purposes. It potentially allows me to connect with an example, right, that I wouldn't necessarily get, or maybe if you did deliver it, believe it, because obviously like you're putting this out, this show, this performance on the stage.
Yep.
And I mean, I can probably connect more with somebody else telling that story, which leads me to kind of the power of other people talking about you rather than you talking about you, and the credibility that brings. And so like, I know there's a lot of architects out there who, I mean, you talk about adoption rates in the industry and things like that of technologies, and a lot of times people are kind of looking for permission or looking for a case study when it comes to giving themselves permission about adopting or moving forward in a way. Were all of these kinds of parts of the conversation when you're strategizing the messaging that's going out, or am I imagining things?
And there are definitely dots there that I haven't joined before. It doesn't mean it's not valid, Evan. Like we are putting on, you said, a stage performance. That's what these keynotes are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they can be incredibly scripted, and the way you keep control of it is to just use your own people, right? But it doesn't serve you well. And I think in terms of that credibility, having somebody provide that case study on your behalf, like we never talked in those terms about it, honestly, but we would look for customers that could best bring our story to life, or best bring a certain aspect to life. Often the format of the keynote would be to go from AEC to manufacturing to entertainment, and you'd kind of consult with those groups and try and find out what their priorities were and what they really wanted to talk about, and then you'd go on this this hunt for the customer that could bring it to life. And that 2018 year after at Walt Disney Imagineering, like he was the dream. Like Disney theme parks are about the only place where you can find AEC tools, manufacturing tools, and media entertainment tools all used in concert together. Like he was a unicorn, and he told his story so well that people thought that we'd employed an actor. Like he was
Wow.
He was a cut above everybody on stage that day, and you would not think it to look at him. He was quite quite introverted, quite in himself in terms of his body language. And then he just came on stage and became this complete other person. But I think, yeah, there's somebody else talking about you got me thinking about something else, actually, in kind of professional reputation. And I wanted to go back to my that hiring manager, that first boss of mine, John Pittman. Like, he deserves a definite shout out. He's retired now, but he had a phrase that he would use, which was, "It's my job to put you under exhilarating levels of stress." And that meant that he had a new assignment for you, and he marched me off and introduced me to some very senior leader who had some like tremendously urgent need for some kind of presentation or story to be developed. And I was just like, that's it, thrown in at the deep end. And I'd been in the job for, like probably not weeks, months at this point. And what that really taught me actually was how to work with a bunch of people with very different working styles, how to flex my own working style to be able to do that. How to expose myself. What he was doing was just exposing me to a bunch of different ideas from all these different kind of organizations and teams and units within Autodesk. But what it really added up to was like just the trust that built in me across the C-suite very quickly. Like, in creating those exhilarating levels of stress for me, like John just established this foundation of trust for me, and I definitely owe him a debt of thanks for that. But I think, I had like John going around talking me up, talking about me, giving me that baseline of credibility that just really translated to trust. And I think, trust is just such an important currency.
Absolutely. Well, Darren, this has been a great conversation, and I'm excited about your launch because a lot of people could use this information to their benefit, and the power of story and actually having a framework to kind of go through to develop that can be used in so many ways, I think could be really useful and valuable for people. So I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's an unconventional URL. It's great-big-story, STORI.es, right? So you got you got an interesting, I love the domain, and I love the idea behind this. And it talks about kind of the wins that you've had and that you're putting to great use with this new venture. So I'm excited for people to check it out. So click the link in the show notes. I'll also have a link to use. People can connect with you on LinkedIn and follow up on this episode. Is there anything that we're missing here?
No, that's probably where I did fail as a client to myself, was spotting how difficult that domain is to read out. Like, it reads great, but then trying to communicate it to somebody else is really tough. Yeah. But I went to great lengths to secure that Spanish domain so that it spelt out stories so beautifully. No, thank you so much for your time, Evan. It's been a total pleasure.
Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co, and I'll talk to you again next week.